We've been on the road for 5 months figuring out where to live next.
Cincinnati was the 5th city that we visited, and by the end of our trip there, none of the other cities we visited were even contenders anymore.
Why? Because in Cincinnati, we found a network of families who are chasing the same kind of vision as we are. If you've watched our other city videos, usually they flow in kind of a format where we're talking about the city and things that we liked and didn't like and that sort of thing. And this video is going to be a lot different than that. We're not really going to talk about so many of the details of Cincinnati. We might do another video about that, but this is going to be more about how our perspective on picking a city really changed while we were in Cincinnati.
Before we get into the details of our visit, let us introduce you to the Pryors.
They're the ones who first articulated this vision that we've latched onto so much, this opportunity for a Jesus-following family to function like a multi-generational team on a shared mission.
They've been pursuing this vision for about 20 years now, and it really shows.
Yeah, Jeremy, the dad of the Pryor family, he often says that their house is like a forward operating outpost of the kingdom of God. They're hosting people at their house several nights a week for kingdom purposes, and their whole family works together to make it possible. And by our best evidence, it seems like they actually like each other.
On top of doing all that themselves, they've also connected with lots of other families throughout the years who've been excited about doing the same thing.
Today, thousands of families across the country have connected to this vision through family teams, but there's a particularly concentrated pocket of dozens of these families in the Cincinnati area because this vision started to spread locally before family teams even existed.
We spent 3 weeks staying in the Cincinnati area, and the first week we stayed in the other half of the duplex where the Pryors live.
That was a very good idea because in that first week, we connected with a lot of other families in the area to help us get a little more of a glimpse of what was going on in this network of families.
Mm-hmm.
As we've tried to explain this vision of our family living as a multi-generational team on a mission together, we've realized that it can sound really abstract and hard to grasp for people that aren't familiar with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're hoping maybe it will help make it a little more concrete by explaining what we observed among some of these different families that we interacted with in Cincinnati.
First of all, there are a lot of practices that these families tend to participate in. Things like Shabbat dinners, family business meetings, celebrating holidays from the Bible like Sukkot, starting family businesses together.
And it can be kind of easy to start focusing just on these like activities and these tools instead of like really what's the heart behind them, which is really the point.
Ultimately, what all these families have in common and what we're trying to pursue ourselves as a family is basically a family identity and mission centered on Jesus.
Sounds really simple, right? Yeah. The Bible uses tons of familial language to describe our relationship with God and each other. To be a Christian is to be adopted into God's family. But as a Westerner, I know I've often looked at that through a really individualistic kind of lens. I get to join God's family. It's all about my relationship with God. And in that way, without realizing it, I had this assumption in my head that because my participation in God's family takes priority over my participation in my earthly family, the two just didn't really mix in my head. We certainly had it in mind that we would be trying to help our kids discover a relationship with Jesus for themselves. But this idea that I could follow Jesus with my kids, alongside my kids, especially as they become adults, that this could become a foundation for the way that we live life together, that was something that was not at all on my radar. And I think that the fundamental thrust of this movement that we find ourselves in is this: your family has permission to be a microcosm of God's family. And your earthly family can in fact be part of God's family together. Just like God designed the church to participate in God's mission, your family can participate in God's mission.
Just like God makes the church to be a place of love, belonging, and encouraging one another, your family can be that too.
And just like God gives us new individual identity in his church, God can give your family a new identity within his church.
I had to hold back a laugh because I was picturing myself trying to talk about a fundamental thrust. This would not be the line for me. Once you look for it, this shows up all over the Bible. From God's covenant with Abraham's family to stories in the New Testament of entire households converting to follow Jesus.
Ultimately, the opportunity here is to follow Jesus as a family. To borrow an illustration from Jeremy Pryor, instead of being like the disconnected and depressed Parr family, you can be the kingdom equivalent of the Incredibles, pushing back darkness and experiencing unrivaled closeness together in the process.
Now that's a pretty exciting vision to us. But how do you actually get there?
Yeah, one challenge is that it takes a long time. You can't really realize this vision fully when you're in our stage of life where you've got like little kids. Our oldest son is 2 and our second one is in there. I think you should like... Woo! I'm sorry, I'm not really a woo person. But safe to say our kids' missional contributions at this point are pretty limited, though cuteness isn't to be underestimated.
Yeah, this does take a really long time. The Pryors are an inspiring example today, but it took decades of incremental progress to get there.
And that's one of the fun things about this network of families in Cincinnati is there are families all across the spectrum of ages and stages pursuing this vision.
There's families like ours where training their toddlers is their biggest family building activity right now.
There are other families who have a mix of older and younger kids who are working on developing a family culture where their older kids help their younger kids and they're working as a team together.
Then there are older families who are trying to figure out what it looks like to employ the gifts of their teenage kids.
And then there are families who are working out what this looks like with their adult kids and their grandkids. And all across the spectrum, these families are figuring out what it looks like to participate in what God is doing together in whatever stage they're in, rather than just focusing on their own development.
And the fact is, a lot of these tools that these families are using really are useful for developing family culture.
Yeah, things like Shabbat dinners where each family member is highlighted and appreciated as a father or a mother or a son or a daughter.
Things like family meetings where vision is cast and plans are made.
Things like dads from across the city gathering to digest the Bible together, challenging and sharpening one another.
Things like celebrating holidays as a family with traditions that remind us that we're invited to be part of a bigger story.
These are tools that we're just really starting to dig into, but a lot of these families have really been in the process of figuring out how to implement these over the course of many years, and just feels like a real trove of wisdom to be able to pull from.
Yeah. So, I mean, Cincinnati was a cool city. It checked all the boxes we set out with. But by the end of our trip, that's just really not where our focus was.
Yeah, our focus really changed to be on these other families that were pursuing the same kind of vision that we are, many of them much further down the road than us.
With that kind of network available to learn from and partner with, Cincinnati pretty much jumped to the top of our list.
But even with all of that, there was still one more city that we were seriously considering.
A place that was very different than the rest of our options.
Stay tuned for our next video where we'll talk about it.